wrote in her memoir 14 years ago about her father, Lev Yosef Rosenstein, after whom I was named, Leonard Jordan Lehrman. Actually, his name was Yosef Lev, but they called him Lev Yosef because his mother's father's name was also Yosef. Her mother's father's name, my mother's father's name. Very confusing. Okay, Lev was born in 1886 in Berdichev in Ukraine. Both of my mother's parents came from large, well-to-do families. I printed out her mother's family tree, and I have some copies for those who want. Unfortunately, I don't have one of her father's family, but we'll talk about that later. Her mother was born in Bobruisk, near Minsk, in 1891, was fluent in Russian and Yiddish. Her father in Russian, Yiddish, and Hebrew. He had 5 brothers, but the only one my mother knew was his younger brother, Osher, whose daughter Musa is here. In March 1921, the new economic policy was announced, and Lev, my mother's father, opened his own business dealing in dried fruit and then processing sausage casings out of animal intestines. With the beginning of the 5-year plan period, 5 years later, NEP, the new economic policy, was abolished, so he closed his enterprise. I'm reading from my mother's memoir. The changed economic rules were accompanied by harassment of those who had been in business, the implication being that the business people had not paid enough taxes. One day, in the winter of 1929 to 1930, government agents arrived at our apartment and confiscated much of our furniture, supposedly to pay for the back taxes. We then moved to Zubchaninovka, the village where we had been spending our summers. But soon government agents came to Zubchaninovka and took much of the rest of the furniture. My father was taken to prison. He came back after a few days unshaven, but in a surprisingly upbeat mood. Nothing happened in prison. He was simply kept there a few days and then released. But a lawyer advised him to leave town. It was then he went to Dushanbe in Tajikistan, near the Afghanistan border. After he left, we had another visit from government agents. This time they were looking for gold objects. They searched the whole house and yard and found a jar with some gold coins and pieces of jewelry which my parents had buried in the root cellar. And of course they took it. Then, since my father had left town, my mother thought they would come back to take her to prison. Calmly she said, and I can still hear her, "I will take Emma with me." But no one came. And soon my mother and I left for Bobruisk. Eventually the family reunited in Dushanbe. In July 1931, Lev got sick. On a brutally hot day, he drank some iced water. The next day he had high fever. They took him to a railroad workers' hospital, the other end of the town, which Seema said was a very good hospital. She went with him. He had pneumonia. He was in the hospital for a week. She stayed there with him the entire time, coming home only to cook something that she could take to him. And this was before antibiotics. At the end of the week, Lev died. He was 45. Seema came home. My mother was so overjoyed to see her, she didn't even ask about her father. And Seema said, "Aren't you going to ask about father?" Seema lied, saying he was having a crisis and that its outcome would determine whether he survived or not. This was not true. He had already had the crisis and had not survived. That's why she came home.
Slow down.
Okay. She was trying to break the news gradually. In the morning, she told Mom that he had died. We had made ready to go to the hospital for the funeral, she writes. I kept thinking maybe when we got there, we'd find him alive and out of bed. When we arrived at the hospital, the coffin was placed on a horse-drawn wagon. I was put on the wagon next to it. My mother walked behind the wagon alone. Behind her, many, many people, all the people who worked with my father. A brass band played a funeral march. I'm sorry, Mom, we don't have a brass band. We have a few other things, though. The cemetery was on a slight hill outside of town. When we got to the gravesite, they put the coffin on the ground and opened it. My mother knelt next to it. She told me to come close. I really didn't want to, but she said, "Come, this is your father." But it wasn't my father. I certainly did not recognize my father in this white, shriveled body with a shock of black hair. I wanted to remember my father as I knew him. I have never looked at a dead body again. I think the Jewish custom in the United States, where the coffin is kept closed, is by far a better way. 2 weeks later, my mother and my brother went to the cemetery. They took with them a marker, a large board on which were lettered my father's name and dates. It was mounted on a narrow board which was to be hammered into the ground. It was nothing like a permanent gravestone. I don't know how long it survived. Before they left, remembering how much my mother cried at the funeral, I made her promise that she wouldn't cry. I didn't know that one had to cry when grieving. Reading and rereading my mother's memoir of her father, the man I'm named after, I've had this uncanny feeling of being there with her, experiencing the death of a parent in a hospital, and having to view the corpse as I just did. Her hands were still warm in the hospital, but they're ice cold. We all thought, or at least hoped, having been told the chances were at least 98% she would be coming home after her operation. But she was 91, 99 pounds, and had had malaria, mumps, measles, pemphigus, hip surgery, breast cancer, and radiation for it. And even the latest technology could not detect the small spicula of calcium that would pierce her aorta after the valve replacement seemed to have been successfully completed. The doctors worked desperately to try to save her, and they seemed nearly as distraught as my father and I when they came in to tell us they had failed. It reminded me of one of my first memories of her. I was 3 and in the hospital where I had my tonsils out for what eventually turned out to be allergies. But the doctors kept me there for what seemed days on end until I just stopped eating, kind of hunger strike. They then told my mother, take him home and feed him. He's smarter than you, was her parting shot. She told that story many times to express her exasperation with doctors and hospitals. She recalled that I wouldn't let her out of my sight for a year after that. She taught me Russian. My father's brother, Edgar, a Russian literature scholar who married a Russian woman, was very envious. Why don't your children speak Russian, I once asked him. Because their mother won't teach them, he replied angrily. I guess I was rather fortunate. She taught me to read English at least a year before any of my classmates, so in first grade I got to read and be Dr. Dolittle. All the other children were the animals. It's true. She also taught me how to write, to type, to play the piano, chess, ping pong, even how to hit a baseball. Right, Laura?
You're good at it.
One science project I did involved voice change in adolescence. My mother actually had a beautiful singing voice, but had difficulty producing the sounds she heard, and was always told she couldn't carry a tune, though she loved both words and music. So in her late 30s, she took a few singing lessons from Esther Corey. I read in our 1911 Britannica that voice change in midlife was sometimes caused by ossification. That's it, she said. I'm ossifying. I'm becoming a fossil. Well, we all laughed then. How could we have known it would indeed be ossification or calcification that would kill her? In 1961, my mother took me to a Ban the Bomb demonstration at the UN. I still have one of the posters we carried. The following year in junior high school, I wrote my first musical on atomic testing. My mother loved that piece and was still singing parts of it half a century later. My brother started singing it before. She knew she had inspired it. And right up to my birthday reading of my grand opera Hannah this past summer, she attended just about every one of my productions, even in Europe, with my father. The last performance of ours she attended was December 1st at the Bryant Library, the final concert in the series Jewish Opera Lives. And that's also the title of a series I'll be giving, a series of lectures I'll be starting next Tuesday at Community Church in Manhattan, dedicated to her memory. As a child, my mother memorized lyrics to whatever opera arias she heard in Russian. With us, she would listen to records and help us transcribe the words to shows like Threepenny Opera, Peter Pan, and My Fair Lady. When my attempt to organize a community production of Peter Pan did not succeed, I did succeed in persuading my mother to give my new baby sister the middle name of Wendy's child, Jane. My sister Betty has never forgiven me for that. I was more successful with organizing the production of My Fair Lady, having all the lyrics already transcribed and memorized, when two great sixth grade classes decided to collaborate on Pygmalion with My Fair Lady songs, and I got to play Higgins. People were asking the other day why my mother spoke English so perfectly. Well, there's a line from My Fair Lady that explains it. Her English is too good. That clearly indicates that she is foreign, whereas others are instructed in their native language. English people aren't. She also spoke extremely distinctly because her mother, due to a 1920 typhus epidemic, was quite deaf. Having come from Russia at age 12, knowing no English, my mother became the greatest editor any of us who knew her has ever known. People from the library can attest to that. She was an incredible teacher and would have had a career teaching had it not been for the McCarthyist loyalty oaths demanded of the profession. Instead, she became a librarian, cataloged the Russian collection at Hofstra, reorganized the medical library at Kingsborough State Hospital where my father was working, and became the go-to person for any literature issued by the Instructional Media Center at LIU Post, where she served for 28 years. She was also a first-rate translator of the novella, what's over here, A Week Like Any Other Week, from Massachusetts Review, and with me of poems and libretti by Yevtushenko, Bloch, Khlebnikov, Mayakovsky, Fett, Krylov, Chekhov, Sholokhov, Derzhavin, which Helene will sing presently, and of course her beloved Pushkin. On March 1st, 1993, my father took her to a movie and brought her home to Nob Hill, where she noticed lots of cars parked near our house. Someone must be having a party, she mused. Only when she got inside did she realize it was her own 70th birthday being celebrated. For nearly 40 years, I've given so many parties in this house, but never has there been one for me before this, she exclaimed, and hugged and became indelibly endeared to Helene, who had done most of the preparation with me. Now, this had not been the case with my first wife, Karen, to whom I was married in 1978 at what my mother called a lovely wedding. The only thing wrong was the bride. And of course, she was right. Karen was too young for me. All the successful marriages of hers and her children's have involved women who were older, but yet somehow looked much younger than the men they married. She was not a poet or a musician, but she had such a love and appreciation for words and music that with a collaborator, as my father was, on her book, Folk Tales of Yamur, she was capable of doing and did so much. The translation that she wrote with me of the first Russian opera, Glinka's A Life for the Tsar, was premiered in 1979 by the Bel Canto Opera, and we were so hoping she would live to hear our translation of Guttermans and Pushkin's Rusalka, completed in 1986 in memory of my uncle, Edgar Lehrman. Excerpts have been performed in France and at our Long Island Russian Music Festival 2 years ago. Perhaps it will yet be heard complete in our lifetime. May her memory be not only a blessing,